everyone. Good afternoon. Time is flying. I'm trying to make sense of what time of the day it is. So glad you're all here. I think mainly I just want to offer my gratitude. It takes a lot of hands to put a conference together. Riverside Church, all of the caterers, all of the organizers, all the speakers, all of you for deciding to spend the Saturday with us. So I just really want to say thank you. I'm really glad you're here. I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl for a moment.
Hey, good people. I just want to add Jackie McLeod as well. She's a part of our Beyond the Bars movement, and she helped make this happen from Jersey. And just to show you her reach, and I appreciate you, and thank you for that. And feels so good to be in person. Can we just say, yay? Beyond the Bar movement is back. And so, you know, this is our first time coming back in person. I'm so excited. My heart is beating fast because, this is our people, this is our family, this is our movement, and to see you all in person is just amazing. One of the things that we are going through is that our good colleague, friend, sister, Kathy is not here in person, but she's here in our spirit and in our heart, and we're going to hear something from her later. But right now, I just want to get the energy up, and on the count of three, I want y'all to say, BTB Kathy. 1, 2, 3. BTB Kathy! BTB Kathy! BTB Kathy! We love you, Kathy, and you're here in our spirit.
So this is just so extraordinary to be back in person after 2 years. The last event that many of us were at together was the Beyond the Bars 2 years ago. Kathy, Cheryl, and Cameron, and Shonda, they kept it going. Last year it wasn't in person, but we're back again. So you did an extraordinary job. So big round of applause to get. And also, Kathy was overseeing everything. So nothing happened here without Kathy's input and enthusiasm and really, helping to ensure that her vision for what this conference has become continues today in our absence. Next year, of course, she'll be back in person. But I also sort of wanted to highlight the fact that some of the students that I talked about at Sing Sing, sometimes when I couldn't be here at the conference, that's where I was, are here today at a conference that they've known about, and also students home from Queensborough and from Taconic. So welcome to your first conference in person. I know you were tired listening to me talking about it, but congratulations to you too for all you're doing since you're home. And with this, we'll get off the stage.
Yeah. We have one more quick thing. So we're going to have our next panel in just a moment. And like Cheryl said, Kathy cannot be here today in person, but she is watching somewhere on a computer. And we were fortunate to get a little message from her. So if you could play the video, please.
I want to welcome everybody to Beyond the Bars. My name is Kathy Levine, along with Cheryl Wilkins and Geraldine Downey. We co-founded the Center for Justice. And we're excited that this is our 12th annual Beyond the Bars. It seems like Beyond the Bars is a place where people can come together from around the country and talk about really complex issues that haven't been resolved, including the issues that relate to what struggles have in common and what they don't have in common. This year we're introducing a whole new struggle, which is the issue of climate change and its relationship to the struggles around mass incarceration. We're excited that you're here. We're excited to learn from the conversations that we all have together. And we are just, very, very happy to be able to host this Beyond the Bars again under different circumstances because of COVID. I couldn't be there today because of family issues, but I'm with you in spirit, in my heart, and I can't wait to watch it and be with you in person through Zoom.
BTB, Kathy! BTB, Kathy! BTB!
Kathy, we love you, Kathy, for real. I was listening to the first panel. I'll just say one thing. I was listening to the first panel, and I'm thinking about how hard it is to build things, and what Kathy and Cheryl and Geraldine and me, as a lucky person, have been able to build, I think is really beautiful. And we love Kathy. We miss her today. So if the next panel could come up, Nadia, Sumaya, Asha, and Darren. I'm just going to quickly introduce Nadia, and she's going to introduce everyone else. Nadia Ben Youssef is many things. She's the Advocacy Director at the Center for Constitutional Rights. She has a long history of movement, organizing, and advocacy work, in particular around Palestine. I think the one thing I'll add is that in terms of people who taught me about the importance of organizing across issues and across movements and the power of solidarity, Nadia has been one of my biggest teachers, so thank you, and I hope the panel's great.
Awesome. Thanks, Cameron. What an honor to be here. I met Kathy in December of 2014 in Palestine. Kathy and Sheza were visiting, and the next year I came to my first Beyond the Bars conference, so it's an honor to be here and to be with all of you, and agree that it's emotional to be in person. We're talking about organizing at the intersections, and we're going to build on that incredible panel that we heard. And Tamisha, when you were speaking and you asked at the beginning of your opening remarks, like, how do we do this? How do we come together to fight? And you said, especially when we know we are the multitude. And so I want to start with a story, and then we're going to dive into the intersections with this extraordinary panel, which I love and has helped me understand how to make the empire tremble, which is what we do when we build at the intersection. And so it's a story that takes place in the Roman Empire. And it's a time in the Roman Empire where there's a massive influx, there's a kidnapping and a massive influx of enslaved people in Rome. And at the time in Rome, there are civility laws, meaning it's how you comport yourself on the street. So, for example, you can't strike a free person in Rome, but you could an enslaved person. And it was chaos in the streets. And a senator comes to the Roman Senate and says, we have to deal with this. This is total chaos. And he has an idea and says, we should give the enslaved a distinctive dress so we know who is enslaved and who is free. And as the story goes, Seneca says that's a terrible idea. If we give the enslaved a distinctive dress, they will know how numerous they are. If we give the enslaved a distinctive dress, they will know how numerous they are. We are the multitude, as Tamisha said. We are the multitude, and when we build, when we recognize each other and each other's struggles, when we etch each other's struggles onto ourselves, and we move through the world knowing that we are the multitude, that is when we win. And that is when the empire trembles, and that's what we're going to talk about today with this awesome panel. I'm super excited to be with you all. We have Asha Rosa Ransbury-Sporn, a Chicago-based community organizer committed to growing big, bold movements that get us closer to being a little more free. She was a co-founder of BTB2022, and as a college student helped launch and led a campaign that successfully pressured Columbia University to financially divest over $10 million from the private prison industry. In 2014, Asha was a part of the We Charge Genocide youth delegation to the UN Convention Against Torture, where she testified on the issue of police violence in Chicago. Asha now sits on the steering committee for a citywide campaign to defund the Chicago Police Department and serves as co-director of organizing for Dissenters, an anti-militarist youth organization fighting global policing and war. Sumaya Awad is a Palestinian writer and organizer focusing on Palestine, Islamophobia, immigration, and labor. She's director of strategy at the Adala Justice Project and co-editor of Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. She's a member of NYC DSA. We're going joined on screen by Monica Trinidad, a queer Latinx visual artist and cultural strategist based in Chicago. She is the co-founder of For the People Artist Collective and a member of Just Seeds Artist Cooperative. For over a decade, Monica has created zines, digital graphics, mixed media posters, and other visual art, amplifying youth-led, intersectional, and grassroots abolitionist organizing in Chicago and nationally. And last but not least, Darren Mack, an activist, advocate, and organizer. Darren is a co-director at Freedom Agenda, a member-led organization dedicated to organizing people and communities directly impacted by incarceration to achieve decarceration and system transformation. Folks, this is an awesome panel, and these are organizers who we're going to learn from and think with. And I have a few questions, but I also want you to be thinking too. So we're going to talk about principles and strategies about organizing at the intersection. How do we win? So if you have questions that come up, we're going to leave some time at the end, like half an hour for your own questions too. So keep those in mind. And we're going to get started. I'm going to move into this space. And I'm going to ask you, it's similar to how, Alice, you started the last panel, because I think that that's a perfect way for us to get into this question of reflecting on the theme of this conference, and particularly in your own organizing. So it's the intersection, as we've been talking about, mass punishment, social control, domination, destruction of the planet, extraction and exploitation. So the question is, and Asha, I'll start with you, like how do you see these issues as linked in your own organizing? And then we're going to move through deeper explorations about your work, thinking about the strategies and principles. But the first question is, how do you see these issues linked?
This on? Y'all hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here. It's been a few years for me since I've been at Beyond the Bars. So I want to start to answer this question by talking about where I live in organized Chicago, and then I'll zoom out a little bit from there. And I know I'm not the only Chicagoan in the room, so y'all know some of this stuff. Bear with me. So Chicago, right? Our police department gets 40% of our city's budget. That's $1.8 billion. It also houses the headquarters of the corporate headquarters for Boeing, which is the second largest profiter of weapons sales in the world. Boeing has gotten over $60 million in tax breaks from the city of Chicago since it moved there in 2002, excuse me. All at the same time as throughout the course of, my life, communities, institutions, and programs that everyday people, particularly Black folks, have been divested from. So closures of mental health clinics, the 50 schools that were closed under our previous mayor, Rahm Emanuel, and at the same time as pathways have been paved for corporations like Boeing to profit from public dollars via tax breaks, and for privatization to happen of many of the different types of social services and programs that I believe should be public. And in this context, the city remains racially and economically segregated and deeply, deeply unequal. The role of the police in that, and the reason, why we see, layoffs, budget cuts, all of these things in every other area of kind of public goods except for police, is because, while we see Black neighborhoods specifically get utterly divested from and abandoned, it's in that historical and present context that people have problems, community violence, poverty, and police work to enact more violence, add to those problems, create new problems, and create the illusion that that Black people and their behavior are to blame, instead of the decision makers controlling how resources get allocated, instead of the institutions and structures and corporations profiting from exploitation and abandonment and displacement. So policing works in Chicago, where I live and do organizing, to tell a story that focuses on crime, which is an invented category by policing, or violence, which individualizes things and obscures the focus away from structural divestment and inequality. So that's, just a little bit about how I've seen things play out in my city. I think we can zoom out and see the very same practices, strategies, and experiences globally when we look at, U.S. Border Patrol, ICE, the U.S. military. On a federal level, the military budget approaching $800 billion, $21 billion of that going to corporations like Boeing, who are profiting from and lobbying for more war-making, more militarism. Those resources could fund a massive federal jobs program. Maybe jobs for people doing things like building clean energy infrastructure. Maybe jobs for people doing care work and providing real safety in communities, doing the things that communities need to thrive other than policing and militarism. And so I'm really interested in organizing campaigns and have engaged from my early days as a student at Columbia doing divestment work to defund police campaigns in Chicago, to the work we do at dissenters, where we have young folks who are pressuring their college campuses to divest from weapons manufacturers and pressure cities to cut ties with corporations like Boeing. I'm really interested in organizing campaigns that look at how resources are allocated and distributed, how investments are made, and putting the fire to decision makers to answer the question of why. We didn't just get here, right? Decisions were made and for a reason, and there's an incentive there, and I think there's a lot of power in getting to that question of why, and looking at a budget, looking at what gets invested in and what doesn't, forces us to look at kind of the big picture of the different things that we're fighting for and against and how they connect. And I think it's important, as I say this, that the point in focusing on budgets or investment practices isn't just about money. It's not really even about money at all. It's about values and priorities in our society, and how resources get allocated is an expression of that. So what we see in those priorities when we look at the federal budget, when we look at the City of Chicago budget, we see that there's a prioritization of profit, a prioritization of advancing, neoliberal reforms that pave way for corporations to profit from and steal from, as Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore gave us, the framework and language to talk about stolen resources. Public money, public resources are actually resources that were stolen from all of us, and that we should get a say in where they go. And so anyway, that's a little bit about some of the organizing campaigns that I think are important, involved in work to reduce the Chicago Police Department budget and reinvest that in Black communities in Chicago. At dissenters, we have young people who are, as I said, working to get their colleges and universities to divest from weapons manufacturers, and are making progress in doing so. Students at University of Houston just had a win getting their student government to vote to divest from the war industry. Loyola dissenters in Chicago had a similar victory getting their student government to vote around supporting divestment from war making. And our Boeing Arms Genocide campaign that is resisting the city funds that Boeing is getting in Chicago just had a win of the first in those 20 years that Boeing has been in Chicago after pressure from our campaign, isn't filing for that tax reimbursement because they know that there is fire and heat coming, and we're going to continue to organize and pressure them in that way. And so, yeah, we see, policing and militarism and the funding and resourcing of it as opposed to in the things that we need as using, violence, the threat of violence, creating and maintaining crises, and maintaining borders as what kind of lays the groundwork for the exploitation and extraction that, capitalism feeds on and requires and, is being prioritized in our society. So that's just a little bit of what I say for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Asha, and thanks, Nadia, for the introduction. It's really great to be here. I don't really know where to start because I feel like so much of what Asha said just can be taken and applied directly to Palestine and what has been happening in Palestine for over a century now. When you look at Israel's project of occupation and settler colonialism, land theft, expropriation, it's all based on, it all necessitates complete climate destruction and desecration. It's not a coincidence that what Israel has done to Palestine and what it's doing to Palestinians has also led to the fragmentation of the land, the physical destruction and desecration of the land, the uprooting of hundreds of thousands of olive trees, turning the Mediterranean, this pristine body of water, into a border, into a militarized border that could represent so many things, and instead just represents incarceration and imprisonment for millions and millions of Palestinians. It's a death trap. This beautiful body of water is a death trap, thanks to the Israeli military. And that all of this is by design, right? Like these are all choices, like Asha was saying, that Israel is choosing every single day and for the last 100 years, and that are directly tied to militarism globally, to the arms industry, to the US government, and how it is profiting off of Israeli apartheid, right? Directly profiting off of, in the material sense, right, the $3.8 billion that Israel sends to, the US sends to Israel every year. A portion of that money is used on weapons created here in the US from corporations like Boeing, right? So Boeing supplies actually most of the bombs that fall on Gaza. The technology they use, the precision technology they use is from Boeing directly. Or settlements that are sprinkled throughout the occupied West Bank, fragmenting Palestinian land and identity. That technology is also used on the US-Mexico border. And so it's these parallels that are so much more than just symbolic. I think we often talk about the symbolism between our struggles, and of course there is so much symbolism, of course there is. There's always so much symbolism between different oppressed groups and the struggles that they're going through, but then there are all of these material connections, organic material connections that also tie us together, and that by design are often underplayed and sort of shoved under the rug by our oppressors while they continue to work together. I mean, they don't have borders. Israel and the US, the governments, the people creating these programs, the people creating the surveillance we all go through, they act and have money going between them and different trade deals as though there were no borders. It's only us, the oppressed, that are forced to navigate these intricate and, by design, very complicated and simultaneously vague systems that keep us apart. And I think one thing in particular that I want to point out that I was thinking about when I was thinking about the theme of this conference is also immigration and the idea of identity and how we're all forced to choose a group and I'd be identified under that, and that restricts how we interact with the world, how we interact with society, whether it's here in New York City and what kind of ID you have to get around, or in Israel and in Palestine, the Israeli ID system that fragments Palestinians so that if you're a Palestinian in Gaza, you could be walking distance from your now occupied home and you can't reach it. You can see it with your own eyes, you could see it with binoculars, you could walk to it. But you can't access it because it's now for a Jewish Israeli only. This idea of supremacy that sort of reigns, Jewish supremacy in Israel, white supremacy here in the US and in other places, and then how class fits into all of this. Who is profiting off of all of these systems of oppression? It's often the same people, it's the same corporations. Meanwhile, we are just increasingly fragmented and pitted against one another. There's so much more I want to say, but I'm also cautious of the time. I think one thing I wanted to mention specifically about the climate climate and incarceration in Palestine is that even when Israeli soldiers marched into the occupied West Bank in 1967, when they took over the occupied West Bank and began the military occupation, there are documents that were found in the Israeli archives that showed how soldiers marveled at the beauty of the land and how Palestinian farmers had taken care of it. The terraced farms, the way that water was used from these natural aquifers all throughout the occupied West Bank, and they marveled at how incredible and efficient it was. And then they proceeded to completely destroy it and build these Jewish-only settlements that do the exact opposite to the land. They completely desecrate the land. They bring in invasive species from abroad. They've destroyed the water aquifers and instead created these enclaves of Palestinian cities and towns, often surrounded entirely by walls or militarized fences. And so they know what they're doing, right? They're very aware of what this is doing to the land and to the people, and they continue to do it. And the answer is profit. They are making money. People are making millions and millions, billions of dollars off of this oppression. And I think it's really important, and this is a lot of what we do with Adalah Justice Project, where we work to de-exceptionalize Israel, that what Israel is doing is nothing new. We're seeing it playing out here in the US, as Asha was saying, in Chicago. It's happened historically before Palestine, right? This is not the first instance of settler colonialism, as the US is the biggest example of that. What's happening in Hawaii in the previous panel, someone mentioned the Red Hill tanks, Puerto Rico, and the list is long. And so Israel is just, it's one block in that chain. And I think we really need to work to de-exceptionalize that, and that's part of the work that we're doing at Adalah. Thank you.
Yeah, when I was thinking about your question, I was thinking about a statement or phrase that Audre Lorde had mentioned, and I'm probably butchering it, but it was like, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And I also thought about, some of the work that I do, organizing work around, that intersects around various issues. Some of them I can't talk about, some of the work that I do, and some work that I do I can't talk about, so I'm gonna talk about that. And one of them is there's this collective of currently incarcerated people known as Jailhouse Lawyers Speaks. And you should follow them on Twitter, Instagram. They speak for themselves, basically. And I've been engaged with some work with them for several years now. And in 2018, some people might remember that Jailhouse Lawyers Speak. They organized probably one of the largest nationwide strikes in the country. And they basically organized people from different states incarcerated in prison across states, a lot of the states in the South. And they came together with this platform, and it's with 10 demands. And those 10 demands are basically it intersects in a lot of ways. So in 2020, last year, they called on people across the country to do strikes at prisons, jails, and ICE detention centers. So I organized with some folks in New York City to do an action at what's called the BOAT, or the Vernon C. Bain Center, the barge. So New York, basically, New York City has probably the only jail boat in the country. It's called the barge, and it's adjacent to the Bronx. So we did an actual, I had to reach out, so I'm looking at the platform. On the platform, you have 10 demands. One of them used to be the restoration of Pell Grants for incarcerated students, but in December 2020, thanks to advocates and directly impacted people and allies, Congress basically restored Pell Grants for incarcerated students. So that was a victory. Actually, this week, TAP, tuition assistance program, was restored after 20-something years in New York. So, thanks to the advocates and the allies who worked on that. So because that was restored for Pell, was restored for incarcerated students, they did away with that demand and they replaced it with the immediate release of all political prisoners. So basically, I had to reach out to different organizations that basically was actually engaged in the work for each of the demands. And one of the organizations that I reached out to was the Northeast Political Prisoner Coalition, NEPPC. And this was basically co-founded by the elder Sekou Odinga and others. So Sekou Odinga, former political prisoner, veteran BLA, he did the time already, so I could say it. He basically did the time for being the architect of getting Assata Shakur free. And so I reached out to that formation to get, to have a representative speak about this issue about political prisoners. Because we have political prisoners, in this country, even though this country don't want to recognize it, but we have political prisoners in this country. So I reached out to different folks. That was one organization. Another issue on the platform, one of the 10 demands was the immediate improvement of conditions of confinement. So we had someone to speak on that. And as the last panel mentioned, that's important. That's important in regards to, the conditions of confinement that people are incarcerated in. And so organizing across issues, we had people that spoke about political prisoners. I reached out to an organization called the Gangs Coalition. Here in New York, there's a coalition of people who work with this Gangs Coalition because the NYPD has this database where they put, if you could just be not even affiliated with a street formation. I don't really like to call it gangs, but a street formation. You don't even have to be affiliated, but if you and a few of your friends in the neighborhood, in the block, could get stopped and searched, and your ID could be taken by the police, and they put you in the system as being a part of a gang. And even like people as young as 12 and 13 years old was like in this gang database system. So we had a representative to speak on that, because inside prisons, people who are not affiliated with the street formations, or they might be like affiliated with, have a radical politics, like, maybe like the Black Guerrilla family or something like that. Inside prison, they are labeled as gangs. Even at one time in the country, people who practice Islam, Muslims, was considered as a gang by the Department of Corrections. So, and different faith groups and ideological groups were considered gangs. So that's why that demand in regards to the oppression, ending the oppression of people who are affiliated with street formation was one of the demands on the 10 demands. So we had the Gangs Coalition speak about, their work that they actually engaged in New York City. So that platform basically is like people working on different issues, and we intersect on this platform by coming together to have an action at the boat. And there's like other work that I'm engaged in, like around the campaign to close Rikers and what's going to happen when Rikers is closed. So there was ideas about, okay, they could build Rikers Island as an extension of LaGuardia Airport. But people who are impacted by it is like, how did that benefit those people who've been suffering and still suffering, going through, Torture Island for decades and to today? So we collaborate with environmental justice groups, like NRDC and NOPE, the New York Lawyers for Public Trust, and we said, you know what? Since Rikers is a toxic island, it's 90% built landfill. How about we address some of climate or environmental justice issues to change Rikers Island? So a campaign called Renewable Rikers was launched, which is basically in New York City, they have these things called peaker plants. So peaker plants, like, is mostly in communities of color, and when a city utilizes a certain amount of energy, these peaker plants kick in, like, to keep, so the city won't black out. But the problem is that these peaker plants exhume a lot of toxicities into the atmosphere. And they mostly in communities of color. A lot of communities have said that it was going to be temporary, but they've been there for decades. Actually, if you live in the Queensbridge houses, which is the largest NYCHA housing in the country, you can see actually one of these peaker plants from the window. So the vision of Renewable Rikers is to make Rikers Island green, sustainable energy to power the city and remove these peaker plants out of these communities. So one, it would create, green, sustainable energy. Two, it would create space for these communities to decide whatever they want with it, and that's another battle, because anytime there's space, there's going to be a fight for it. So we have to organize those communities that's impacted by that. And three, moving towards green energies, and green jobs, et cetera. But before we get there, we got to get Rikers shut down. So I'll end it with that.
Such powerful work, and you see the connections being made. Like, once you start seeing how all of these struggles are linked, you're like, we're going to start making our demands differently. Because we're not going to just ask for what is practical, what the state will concede to, and be like, sure, we'll give you a toxic airport instead. You ask for what is necessary, for what is life-giving, for what is just, for all of us, and for this entire community that is struggling for justice, and we refuse to let some people go. And that's what I think this kind of praxis, the actual practice of solidarity requires of us, which is like, it's all of us. And I think that happened in the last panel too. And when you start thinking that way, suddenly your demands become clearer. And so I'm interested in going a little bit further into your own work and just like how this kind of cross-movement building has shifted the way that you struggle. So it's, as you're working across issues to build power or to disrupt narratives around violence, disrupt narratives around supremacy, I think you said, Sumaya, like, how does it shift, right? So thinking about some of the lessons learned or principles about this work. So as you're building across movements, what changes in your work? And then we're going to get into some examples, but I'm interested in like that orientation. What does it demand of you as an organizer? Asha, go ahead.
So I started organizing as a student in a group called Students Against Mass Incarceration, which is where I learned about prison abolition. And not long after that, I was a part of starting something called BYP100, in which we use what we talk about as a Black queer feminist lens. And those two kind of pillars were what, guided my political development. And I think to speak a little bit to Black queer feminism and what we understood that to be in BYP100, drawing on, the legacy of the Combahee River Collective, the legacy of Insight Women of Color Against Violence, and many other, iterations of, I think, Black feminists in particular leading the way and really different frameworks for that, for understanding that Audre Lorde quote that you mentioned, right? We can't understand issues as single because we are not single. And so Black queer feminism offered to me as a kind of guide of, yes, in this organization, we are primarily centering Blackness, we're young Black people fighting for our liberation, and that's not the only axis that we need to consider when we're talking about people's relationship to power. So we should be talking about queerness, gender, and sexuality, and how that impacts how people are able to move and experience, you know, the oppression of different systems that we live under. We have to be incorporating an analysis of class. We have to be internationalist. We can't just be talking about whoever is in the room at this moment, or, you know, whoever is at the center of that room, or whoever is impacted by a particular system in one way. But when we bring in folks who are experiencing marginalization, whether it's in terms of citizenship status or gender or race or class or, you know, whatever else, then we have to understand how the systems are working together too, because that is what is being reflected in the experiences of folks that, you know, live at intersections. And, you know, I think coming to Dissenters, a, you know, relatively new-ish organization, we're about 2 years old, and, you know, I came in a little over a year and a half ago, really finding a space where the Black organizing work that I had been doing against policing in particular was affirmed as also anti-imperialist, anti-militarist work that we can see as in connection to a global struggle, and how so many different peoples are experiencing similar forms of violence, you know, and living particular realities and in particular contexts of that violence, but, you know, for the same purpose of kind of maintaining these social, political, economic hierarchies in society that lay the groundwork for extraction, exploitation, and profit. And so I think, you know, really seeing that as informed by, I think, you know, the Panthers offered a framework for seeing policing in Black communities as an occupying force and framing it as anti-imperialist in that way. But that's just been a little bit of my experience and my journey of my political development, and also, you know, how I've found home in the organization that I'm in now.
It's a great question, and I feel like there's so many different ways to go with it. I think for Palestine work specifically in the US, there is no way to organize around Palestine, whether it's in the US or in Palestine, without connecting it to other struggles. That the struggle will not move forward in any other way, just like any other struggle. But I think particularly with Palestine, because Israel's entire project relies on isolating Palestinians, on isolating who Palestinians are and what they're going through, and instead painting Israel's settler colonial project itself as a project of liberation, so sort of like flipping the narrative. And the only way to undo that is to connect Palestine to so many other things, and do it in a way that's uncompromising and unapologetic. And that's what we're trying to do in the US. I think that's what the Palestine movement is trying to do. It has been quite successful, I would say. And not just recently, but for decades, you know, from 1948, when Israel established itself as a state, is building across borders, building with the other struggles that took place throughout the second half of the 20th century, whether it was, you know, the anti-war movement in Vietnam, the Black Panthers here in the US, the incredible, I mean, I think one of the most inspiring things that I turn to at times where I'm like, this is really hard, and like, we can't, the connections people aren't getting the connections, is the poetry of June Jordan, in which she writes about Palestine and Black liberation and how deeply the two are connected, and what it means to push back against the propaganda, against the narratives that isolate Palestinians. And I also think about how the response from the US government, from Israel, from others, when we do connect the struggles, is so violent and so intense and so disproportionate. You know, the smallest connection we make between two struggles is met with millions and millions of dollars in funding against us, right? When students, like Students for Justice in Palestine, which is where I got involved in organizing around Palestine here in the US, when SJPs on college campuses start talking about a divestment campaign, start holding Palestine 101 conversations, start working with different, you know, Black student unions on campus, or prison divest on campus. Columbia is actually a good example of that, SJP at Columbia and prison divest at Columbia. The reaction is so disproportionate, the way that they clamp down on this. And it's because, as Nadia said at the beginning, when we connect our struggles, it really does make empires tremble because they know that it works, because we recognize how much power we have, how much influence we have in their profit-making machine, and how we're able to show just regular people that this actually has an impact on your life. Right? Palestine is not this faraway thing that has nothing to do with our lives here in New York City. When I was coming here today, I got off at the bus stop right here and I was walking. It was, it had stopped raining, so it was kind of a beautiful day. And then suddenly there was some military plane overhead. It was so loud and so jarring in this otherwise, pretty Riverside Park situation. And it's like, this is everywhere. It's hidden in plain sight, right? What the US military is doing, what Israel is doing, how policing is completely destroying our communities. It's all in plain sight. And simultaneously, it's weirdly hidden and woven into the fabric of society in a way that's supposed to make us feel like this is how it's supposed to be. Not that actually this is by design and it can change because it hasn't always been this way. And I think the Red Hill tanks in Hawaii are just another really good example of this, where you had these 4 giant fuel tanks just in the mountain, in this mountain that looks so beautiful on the outside, and inside are these tanks just leaking fuel, poisoning hundreds of thousands of people. The other thing I wanted to say about this too is that I think one of the really powerful things about this, cross-movement, collective liberation, is that it asserts that none of these struggles are humanitarian struggles, they're political struggles, and that we refuse to allow them to be framed as humanitarian struggles, as, just donate to charity and this will be fine. You care about Gaza and what's happening there, great, donate to Gaza's children. No, that's not what we want. That's not what liberation is. This is a political struggle, and we need to take political stances, and sort of pushing away all of the liberal language around not just reform and charity and humanitarianism, but around this idea that we don't have to have a political stance, right? So often in our work, and this was both on campus as a student and after, the same excuse of, we don't do politics, when in fact everything these people are steeped in is political, right? Every decision you make or don't make, the silence is political. And its impact is not symbolic, its impact is material on people's lives, not just here, but everywhere. And I think the pandemic has really brought that to light in the last few years in particular.
Yeah, I don't have really, they laid it out. I don't really have nothing to add, to what they said, because they basically laid it out, I'll probably just share just a little bit about how my organizing, not much of my organizing has shifted. It kind of like expanded, and like as you mentioned, like it expanded in regards to like the environmental justice work, but a lot of what I'm learning is expanding even more, and that's why, as was mentioned, we have to make those connections internationally, because if we get a win here in New York City around any organizing work we do, the people who oppose that work in other states, even here, but in other states, they're going to be looking and say, we don't want that to happen here, and they're going to be organizing against that. Likewise, if we get a victory here on this settler colonial project called the U.S., don't you think the allies across the world is going to be like, we need to stop that? Yeah. They're going to come and support their allies that's getting crushed over here. So that's why, if we look at the struggles of the past, like the Black Panther Party, they had an international lens. They connected the struggles, like y'all said. You know, so we got to look at the press groups all across the world. What are they doing? Connect, identify with that struggle. And so one of the media outlets that I listen to on YouTube is called Black Power Media. So in Black Power Media, they have like different segments, and one of the segments that they have, Jackie Lukman, she's a host of a program on there, and she's part of an organization called Black Alliance for Peace. And Black Alliance for Peace, they have an international, lens. Actually, I was watching yesterday, and the host, Jackie Lukman, she's actually going to Venezuela to some conference, as a representative for Black Alliance for Peace. So basically what y'all said, we have to have an international lens. We have to connect the struggles all across the world, and we have to, that's the only way we really going to get, freedom and liberation. The people in the past who came before us, they did it, they got it right. How do you think Assata got free to where she at in Cuba? Because it was a relationship built. It was a relationship built. And there's people exiled, political exiles, in other countries as well. And they protect that, and they adhere to that to this day, decades since the struggles in the 60s and the 70s. So that's one of the benefits, because if we have an ally that's powerful in another country, has resources, they could resource our movements here. So yeah, and with that.
I hope you're taking down some of these lessons, right? So, Sumaya, you say the point is to keep us apart. So you have to challenge isolation. We have to challenge isolation because the point is to keep us apart. And Asha, you said, when you connect these struggles, you get so close to the why. You understand the why. Oh, that there's interest in the status quo. There's investment, there's profit. We got to get to the why and then require a recalibration of priorities. Divest from this, invest in community, right? That ask the why. Darren, you're talking about big and bold visions, international visions. Be as big and as bold as we need to thrive. And then I'm loving this idea that these are political decisions, right? This is a political decision. And we have to learn from each other. The oppressors are learning from each other, which is what Sumaya said. They're exchanging strategies, surveillance technologies. We know how to oppress people, control people, segregate people. Let's exchange that. We know how to extract and exploit. So the oppressors are learning from each other, and we need to learn from each other too, from history, from each other's struggles. And so we're going to get into that. But I'm going to ask a question because we're going to turn it over to an artist on the screen, which is are there artists in the room, creatives? Raising your hands. Are there people in the room who can believe that the world can be radically different than it is today? You are artists. You are artists. On this panel, there are organizers, and it requires us to be artists, to imagine something completely different, to unlock our imaginations, to say we don't need the P's. This is Alice Walker, I believe it's Alice Walker, who talked about the kind of 4 P's that we have to uproot in our society, and we're going to add to that, but she said prison, patriarchy, poverty, Palestine. We talked about pollution and pesticides on the first panel, right? We have to think about these kind of broad changes that we need to see in the world. What are we going to uproot? And then the artist will tell us what are we going to build in its place. So I'm going to ask Monica Trinidad, who recorded something, to share a little bit about the role of artists in cross-movement building, in telling stories where we see each other in those stories. And crucially, I think it's the shift from the lenses that you're talking about, Asha, Black queer feminism, abolition as a lens, and also how art makes those lenses mirrors, right? Where you start having to look at yourself. What does Black queer feminism require of me? What does abolition require of me? What do I have to uproot in myself? And I think art lets us get there. So we're going to play Monica answering that question.
Hi everyone, my name is Monica Trinidad. I use she or they pronouns and I'm calling from Chicago. Sorry I can't be there with you all. I hope the sun is not too bright, which isn't a bad thing, right? So the role of the artist in our movements is not a small one, right? It's an essential one. Art helps us to not only envision a world that we're fighting for and building for, but to feel it as well. So just as like our organization or campaign might have a theory of change or a communication strategy, we also have to have a visual strategy and a cultural strategy to effectively communicate our message to the public, and then also to like draw more people into them, right? The visuals that we put out there are often how the public first sees and interacts with our work, so it's incredibly memorable. I mean, think about a campaign that you've supported or you've showed up to, not organized, right? Just like showed up. Do you remember the toolkit that they gave you and what it said, or do you remember the graphics or the visuals that they provided to you, to share online? Or do you remember, the messaging docs or like the messaging that they gave you, right? Or do you remember the t-shirts or the buttons that they passed out at the rally or, the event that you were at? And then also think about like the photos that get taken at the rally or the protests, and then they're like shared out in media. If you don't have visuals, are people gonna really quickly grasp what your message is and what you're fighting for? So that's something that I always think about, like around just like the very foundation of why a visual strategy and a cultural strategy are super important. People who know me and who organize with me know that I always say that the process of making movement art is just as important as the art that's created, if not more so. But I also think it depends on whether your priority is, producing stunning visuals or utilizing art making to build relationships and community power. But I think both can and should be prioritized. Another way to think about what I'm saying is that a cultural strategy is just as important as a visual strategy. A cultural strategy brings in artists, storytellers, media makers, and cultural influencers into your movement building work as agents of social change, so that artists can activate community members as catalysts for social change, through their art and cultural work. But a strong cultural strategy really requires a collaborative process, which means involving artists from day one in your organizing strategy as a very critical component. And a strong visual strategy can come out of this collaborative process. When we as artists show up in movements with both, our creative knowledge and curiosity, we cultivate connection and we build deeper openings in our movements that draw more people in. And Nadia, you asked in your question, what is our obligation to tell the stories that are not only lenses but mirrors? And what I always think about is how critical movement artists is for documenting our struggles and wins. I think about the Celebrate People's History poster series that's been curated by Just Seeds and Josh McPhee. I think of posters by, Ricardo Levins Morales. I think of Micah Bazant, Emery Douglas, Melanie Cervantes, Fabiana Rodriguez. I think of all of these movement artists as just essentially creating like this archival documentation of our movements, our struggles and our wins throughout history. And it's because art can offer historical context for our people to lean on in future movement work. And it can also be an inspiration for those of us who are organizing every single day, who actively have to build up these muscles of hope for the long haul of this work. We need to not only provide our communities with visual stories of power in a world where many feel so powerless, but for ourselves as well. We don't get a lot of wins. So like when we do, we really have to lift those wins up. And art activates people, and it can move us from hundreds of isolated stories to hundreds of connected ones. I'll forever have to lift up the No Cop Academy campaign, not because I was part of it, but because it was such a brilliant example of what a campaign can accomplish when you involve artists and cultural workers from day one. And since I'm still meeting and talking to people who haven't heard of this former campaign, I'll just quickly say that it was a youth-led, intergenerational, and intersectional campaign to stop the proposed construction of a $95 million police academy on Chicago's west side. And artists were involved from day one in that organizing strategy. So instinctively, we launched this campaign with a citywide call for poster art. And the prompt to artists was simple. How would you spend $95 million in your neighborhood? And through doing that, we carved out space for a larger dialogue to take shape and a way for, directly impacted people to share their community's needs. And in turn, then, a pathway towards reimagining collectively a better city and a better world. And we received dozens of poster contributions from across the city in different neighborhoods that highlighted, the need for mental health care, community gardens, after-school programs, and so much more than a new police academy, right, that could offer us. And through this process, then, we invited communities to an exhibition of these posters. And then we use that space to share information about the campaign and how they can get involved. We continuously hosted art builds throughout the campaign. We invited community members to screen print t-shirts and buttons and posters and banners, and we made it fun. Our movements need to be fun if we want people to join them, right? And it's not surprising that by the end of this campaign, which lasted a couple of years, we had over 100 organizations who endorsed this campaign across the city, across the country. We had educators, artists, movement lawyers, environmental justice organizers, socialists, anti-war organizers. We had so many different issue-based organizations because they were able to visually see and understand that $95 million could absolutely be better spent on resources that our communities needed and deserved. And I'm not saying that art and a visual strategy was the sole reason that produced these results, because it wasn't, but it played a role, right? Art is a tool that's part of our organizing strategy, right? It helps us not only break down, the walls and the barriers in our communities and expose, the rot underneath, but it also allows us to build up and shape, a better world and a better future that we're all trying to create collectively. And when we organize with a cultural strategy and when we create artwork in very collaborative methods, right, by including and involving artists in day one in your organizing strategy, we create space for all of our fullest selves to be seen, to be heard, and that is what our movements are doing, right? We want everybody to be seen and heard and cared for. And we're also able to ground ourselves collectively in our values, our principles, and in our visions for a better world. So all of that to say is that art can spark something for people to tangibly connect their story to someone else's, and that is so powerful. And it can change how people perceive themselves and their role in the world. And we need it to keep dreaming up bigger visions for the world that we're building. Thank you.
Love that. Art as connection. It's another value, right? And so this last question before we open it up, and if folks have questions, we'll have 20 minutes or so for your questions. But it is just building on those lessons for us, right? So if you can think of a particular example in your work of cross-movement building, and draw out those principles and strategies. And those can be lessons learned, great lessons, always do this, or totally avoid this is a big disaster, or here's a challenge that we had that we need to overcome, right? So add to this list for us. So what, if you take an example, and Darren, maybe we'll start with you and come back. Take an example in your work, and you spoke about Rikers, but there's a ton for you too of cross-movement building, and then a principle that you want us to take with us, or a strategy that you're like, this works or this doesn't work.
Yeah, so what works or what doesn't work? Well, I think what doesn't work is doing organizing and not centering in people that's impacted by the issue in the work, because if you organizing people and you don't center those who's like directly impacted by the issue, like where's the accountability at? You know, where's the accountability? You could just, you know, say and do, you know, whatever you want and not be held accountable, you know, for what you're doing. So I think as a principle, like any work that we engage in, you know, any organizer that we do, you know, we definitely have to, you know, center and amplify, you know, the people who are directly impacted by the issue. And as organizers, you know, we supposed to, there's a saying like we have to like organize ourselves out of the job, out of the work. So you organize so effectively that the people you organizing, they could manage the whole campaign on their own. That's a good organizer. You know, that's a good organizer. So I'll leave it with that.
I'm going to give an example of a specific campaign that's actually ongoing right now that Adala Justice Project is involved in. So there's this environmental institution called Sierra Club. I don't know how many people have heard of it. I only heard of it for the first time in January. Started to learn about how awful it has been historically and kind of still today. And Sierra Club, like many other organizations in the US, have these trips to Israel. And for Sierra Club specifically, they're nature trips, or that's how they're advertised. Nature trips to Israel where you can like walk around, look at birds, look at trees, all the while ignoring and normalizing, actively normalizing what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And of course these trips are framed as, you know, apolitical. It's just nature trips. Why do we have to bring politics into it? And so a coalition of groups, including Adala Justice Project, Movement for Black Lives, Indian Collective, US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and other groups, it was a very cross-movement coalition, came together and sent Sierra Club a letter saying, you need to cancel these trips. These are not just nature trips, these are actively normalizing apartheid. And Sierra Club had been going through this internal reckoning. It has an incredibly racist past. Its founder was a white supremacist, and had been going through this internal reckoning around, you know, how do we become an anti-racist organization? How do we take more seriously our connections to indigenous struggles in the US, on Turtle Island, in Hawaii? And they had been doing, you know, somewhat of a good job on that. Like a lot of their programs are around indigenous liberation on Turtle Island. But when it came to Palestine, and including Palestine and that narrative of indigenous liberation, they paused, and they didn't want to budge. Eventually, we got them to budge, and they actually canceled the 2 trips that were slated to happen in March. And that was an incredible victory. And it was precisely because of this coalition, this cross-movement coalition, right, that Movement for Black Lives was saying, you can't say you're anti-racist and then choose not to include Palestine in that framework of anti-racism. Indian Collective was saying, you can't say you stand with indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, but not think about Palestinians as indigenous people fighting a settler colonial state. We refuse that. We refuse that framing. We don't accept your solidarity with us if it doesn't extend, if it has boundaries and qualifications. You're either actually for liberation, no exception, or you're not. There's no in-between in this situation. After they canceled their trips, they got a lot of pressure from funders, as usual, right, profit, and they backtracked. And they said, okay, no, we are gonna have a trip to Israel. It's gonna be in the summer. They're planning it right now, so our campaign is ongoing. And the language they used is one that I'm sure we're all familiar with and that we've all talked about today, which is that we don't take political stances. We made a mistake canceling these trips. We don't take political stances. This is just a nature trip. And they kind of doubled down on that, completely ignoring, you know, what we were saying about what was happening in Palestine. And so the campaign is ongoing, but I think one of the really powerful things that we learned from that was, one, the real influence of cross-movement building and being uncompromising even when we don't think we're gonna win. Like, we didn't think they were gonna cancel those 2 trips, we really didn't. But all of the organizations in the coalition were like, it doesn't matter, the point is to put that pressure on, to make it clear that they can't continue their work with Movement for Black Lives, with Indian Collective, without realizing that they're going to have to cancel these trips to do so, that they're going to have to be pushed on this. And what just came out last week, this new article came out about how different states are actually using as a template. Basically, there's, as we all know, there's a clampdown on climate activists in the US, and specifically after what happened at Standing Rock. And a lot of the laws that are coming down against fossil fuel divestment, against attempts to boycott fossil fuel companies, there are anti-boycott laws being introduced in different state legislatures across the country. And the news that came out last week is that the templates for these anti-boycott laws are taken directly from the laws that have been used to target anti-Israel boycotts, so the laws that were targeting Palestinians. And New York State in particular is infamous for this because there's an anti-Israel boycott blacklist, where if you engage in boycotts of Israel, you're on a blacklist. The state won't give you certain types of funding, won't work with you. And this was all thanks to Cuomo, but of course nothing has changed with the new governor, and instead they're just, dumping money into other things, meanwhile clamping down on this type of activism. But the reason I mention this is that one of the reasons the Sierra Club campaign is so important is it shows that you can't separate climate justice from imperialism, right? That this has to be part of our framework, because look at how these laws targeting Palestinians are now targeting climate activists, and we know it won't stop there, that they're gonna continue to expand that. They're gonna come for all the different types of organizers and movement builders that are actively working against this profit-making machine.
The ops are international too.
So there's like an approach to organizing that I've heard that encourages us to look at the big problems in the world and then cut our issue, get really specific, figure out what's winnable, and stick to that. There's some value in specificity and figuring out good demands that we can win, and a strategy, and staying on track, for sure. And I think that it's important to balance that, right, with the principle of solidarity and really making sure that we are embracing organizing strategies that bring more of us together. Because I think that there's a pitfall in that type of approach that can lead us to only fighting for incremental changes, or only a win that's going to impact this one specific set of people, or make an impact for this short-term period of time. And we might get some wins out of those types of organizing strategies, but I don't think that we'll transform systems thinking only that way, and I don't think we'll get free. And so, because this is Beyond the Bars, and we're in West Harlem, I feel like I have to talk about, my time at Columbia a little bit and criticize the institution. So in 2014, I was a student organizer. We were organizing around prison divestment at Columbia. I was also a part of BTB2022. We were organizing around police violence in New York City and around the country. And some of the advice that we got as prison divest organizers was stick to prisons. One of the companies that we were targeting Columbia divesting from was G4S, which at the time maybe still is the largest multinational security company in the world, operates checkpoints and prisons in occupied Palestine. And we were told, focus on prisons, stop talking about Palestine, you just might win, but if you keep talking about Palestine, you probably won't. And we rejected that advice. We built, deep, strong coalition with the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. We're in the University Senate with, signs that were maybe about to lose us the deciding vote on our campaign, but there were a lot more of us. And anyway, so in 2014, the NYPD conducted what was, labeled as the largest gang raid in NYPD history on the Grant and Manhattanville houses just up the street. And this was over the summer, and as students, we got a university-wide email congratulating the NYPD and thanking them for making our community safer in the name of the safety of students. And me and my friends were like, what the, ever. And, you know, I think one approach in that moment could have been to kind of notice this, but say, we're gonna stick to our lane, we're running this divestment campaign, we're focused on like the university and its investments, or even the university, only just the university's role in policing and in this raid that, you know, over 100 young black and brown men were locked up in this raid. We see that as a part to community violence, and saying there is a very strong, well-funded NYPD and Columbia media and narrative campaign that's very strategically trying to divide us. For students to feel like this is a thing that's keeping us safe, for folks who are combating community violence to be in collaboration with the police, and for folks who are you know, doing anti-criminalization work and resisting that in their own lives and communities to be in their separate corner. But instead, there were you know, a number of coalition organizing meetings. I just think, you know, really, really deep solidarity meetings, conversations, you know, where people were like, I believe this narrative that we had separate interests, and now we're in the room together, and I see that we don't. And, you know, as students, right, experiencing racism by the Columbia University Police Department as well, you know, we had a stake in this too. So I don't know, that's like one example. I think it's dope to be a part of Dissenters Now and see young people who are running Divest from Death campaigns, targeting weapons manufacturers that are profiting from war, in collaboration with students who are doing cops off campus work, and kind of continuing in that tradition of this, you know, we are running maybe different campaigns with different targets, but we're together in this, and we're gonna learn from each other, and we're not gonna, you know, fall into that trap of a kind of single issue organizing strategy, because there are so much more of us when we collaborate and when we come together, and our coalitions are so much bigger.
Thank you all so much. We are everything we need. We get it. Like, we also know what will win, and of course that scares the powerful. And they try to divide, and they try to make it really, really complicated to see these connections, right? Or to force us into these spaces where we have to compromise or make choices or believe that you can only save yourself in this. We know what it takes to thrive. We know what we need, we know what we deserve. There's tons of lessons here, but I want, if there's a mic here to my left, if folks have a couple of questions, maybe we can take a couple of questions. I know you all are eating, saha, for those who are fasting, Ramadan Kareem. But if you have some questions, we're happy to take a few. And there's a mic here. I don't know if I see some folks.
Hi. This is actually a little bit less of a question, although I certainly welcome comments. I think it's important for people to understand that the question of Israel-Palestine and the question of policing is in fact intimately entwined. I'm not sure how many people know that our police are trained in Israel with the Palestinians as the people on whom they are trained, and that there is a move, and I'm not quite sure where New York is at this point, to not send our police to train in essentially military tactics, which we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, what the police were using, and that our government, up until recently, by distributing weapons, excess military weapons to police force, are militarizing that, so that you have this combination of the Israel-Palestine question and the techniques that are being used in Israel and or by Israelis on the West Bank and Gaza, that they are transferring these techniques to use in poor communities in this country.
Yeah, this is one of the lessons learned, right? That our oppressors are learning from each other. And so that there is so much that we can do in terms of learning from those of us who are struggling for justice. If there are not any other questions, I'm happy to give you a last word, each of you, if you want to just share one more thing to the group of us who are here and gathering and are ready to build, like ready to organize, ready to build, believe in the world that we want to see, that we can't yet see, or the artists allow us to see. There's one more thing that you might want to leave us with before we close. I would love to hear it from you.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Monica Trinidad was saying in her video about the importance of art. It's very, very, very important. You know, if we think about, like, I love to, you know, to go to actions and do chants. And some people might not know this, but the Black Panther Party, they had a group, a music group called the Lumpin'. And I just got the book recently about the history of that. And they had songs, I think, like Free Bobby and other songs as well. And music, like, I'm a big hip hop fan. I grew up on hip hop. I still love hip hop. And music has influenced the youth. You know, like one of the artists that I like a lot is like Tupac Shakur. You know, he comes from a movement family. His mother, Afeni Shakur, who passed away, she was part of the Panther 21. And his stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, who's a political prisoner, incarcerated right now. And, you know, people actually should like go online and look up Mutulu Shakur and sign a petition, because he's actually going to be up for, you know, parole, I believe, soon, you know. So, you know, Tupac, he was like, kind of like how Malcolm was. You know, Malcolm X grew up in a house where his father was a Garveyite, you know, and he learned stuff from his family, you know, from his father, from his parents, you know, about Africa and about, you know, being, you know, conscious stuff. But, you know, he got to the streets, he became Detroit Red. But, you know, when he got incarcerated, those seeds that was already in him from his parents, it was watered, you know, so by the Nation of Islam, and he became Malcolm X. So I'm saying that because, like, Tupac, he came from a movement family, and I believe that he was coming around. You know, some of his music that I listened to today, you could hear, like, every album that he always had some conscious raising lyrics in his music. And it was mixed, yeah, it was mixed. It had some other problematic stuff too, you know, a lot of his music. But because he had those seeds implanted in him, the people who probably wouldn't listen to him when he talk about revolution and stuff like that, would listen to, you know, his other music. And then they'll probably come across those conscious lyrics, and that would plant a seed. So art is very important. Music is a part of art. There was like the chants that used to happen, like today, like some chants, I don't really like those civil rights chants that people be doing, because I'm trying to move away from that, but it was like chants, if we look across move, like chants today have an impact. People who, you know, who create and develop chants, it has an impact. Like, it was a time, it was chants like in the party, the Black Panther Party, they had chants like, time to pick up the gun, off the pig. The revolution has come, off the pig. Today, it's like, hands up, don't shoot. So like, chants is part of art, music is part of art, and we have to contend with some music and chants that's not in line, you know, with our politics. So to the artists out there, you know, we need some conscious music.
Beautiful.
Two things come to mind, and I'm going to try to be very brief for the sake of time. The first is, I think very often, and especially right now, and with what's happening in Palestine right now, things are just getting worse and worse, even though I think the movement for Palestine in the US is growing stronger and stronger, and there's definitely a correlation between those two things. Is I often find myself just reminding myself that it can feel like we can't win, that it's kind of, it's all too much, too big, too complicated. And I think back to actually when I was a student too, and at Columbia, when we started the BDS campaign at Columbia, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions campaign at Columbia, how the idea of winning that at a place like Columbia University seemed absolutely impossible. At a place where Zionists were organized and well-funded and had the backing of the administration and the city and the state. The idea that an SJP could win a divestment campaign seemed impossible, and still we pushed for it and we built for it and spent many hours, coupled with schoolwork and other things, fighting for it, and then, graduated. And then, new freshman class came in, and that one graduated too, and then they won it. And then they won the campaign a couple of years later. And when we started it, no one expected it to go that far, that fast. And I think I remember when the news came out, it was such a shock and really emotional, because you realize that things change quickly. The world is changing quickly, and we are winning slowly, and then sometimes some big things happen and we win big moments, and then things die down again, and then it comes back. And it's hard to predict, and it's hard to know, and so we fight as though that moment, that opportunity is just going to be tomorrow. And we hold on to that, and sort of balancing this idea, and I think, Asha, you mentioned this really well, I want to take your words exactly, that you have to balance this whole, what is realistic and possible, and what are we fighting for that seems impossible, but we know we can win. And that the people who have come before us, the generations that have come before us, has taught us that. And this links to the other thing I wanted to mention that I'm constantly sort of grappling with, which is the past and the struggles of the past and the organizers of the past, and specifically with Palestine. There are so many incredible people to name. Ghassan Kanafani is one of the first that comes to mind. But also how important it is not to romanticize the past and get stuck in the past and the strategies of the past. To study them and learn from them, from the people and the movements and the campaigns that brought us to where we are, without treating them as a blueprint for where we want to go. And I think it's really tough to do that, and it can be easy to get sucked into romanticizing the past, but how important it is to look at our context now, with all that we've learned from those who've come before us, and then to think about what is our strategy for what comes next, what is our blueprint for what we want to build, and to be humble, but also visionary and confident in that we're able to do that with what we have today, with who we are today, and where our movement is today.
Really appreciate what both of you shared. So the theme of this year's conference, Movement Building in a World on Fire, I think had me reflecting on how I, as an organizer these days, talk to a lot of people who feel like it's the end of the world. Impending climate climate catastrophe, the ongoing reality of war, just policing getting so much worse, the just extreme repression and decimation of our movements when we do try to resist. And, that is real. That is a real way to feel in the times that we're in. And I think and I promise this will be hopeful. And I think the thing that is maybe not hopeful, but grounding for me is just to think about, zooming out historically, the world has ended before, I think about, what would it have been like to experience captivity in the context of chattel slavery, to experience settler colonialism, of the United States, just to experience colonization, to experience chattel slavery, to experience many things that have come before in the past. And that's not to say that everything will survive or that the pathway through will be great, but it does mean that there will be something after, that the world is constantly being remade, and it may be inevitable that it will change. It may be inevitable that some harmful things will continue to happen, but it's not inevitable how it will be in the future. And we have just a stake in that in such a serious way. And so, just to tell one more short snippet of a story, in May of last year, in 2021, was the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and in Chicago, folks were organizing a defund, police rally to commemorate the life of George Floyd. The kind of slogan of it was "Mourn the dead, fight like hell for the living." In May of 2020 was also the moment where Israel was escalating its assault, particularly on the community of Sheikh Jarrah. There were uprisings and solidarity protests all around the world. Our dissenters members were involved in that, and building coalition with Students in Justice for Palestine. The State Department was trying to push through and approve a $735 million weapons deal by Boeing, and so we were calling attention to their presence in Chicago, and so there was a SJP-led rally against Boeing on that day. There was this defund thing, and then there'd also been this fight around the Columbus statue in Chicago that indigenous young folks have been fighting around. And so, the single issue approach would have been there's a bunch of competing rallies, we're gonna focus on turnout for our one thing, whatever. And Chicago's a deeply, deeply segregated city, so it's not easy to know what's going on in different people's communities. But what happened was Black and brown and indigenous and Palestinian young folks and community members, came together, and there was a march that started with the defund the police stuff, that went to the Columbus statue, which now it looks like is not going to be put back up in Chicago after it was, protested last summer, and then, marched and joined the rally at Boeing with SJP. And now there's a win in that campaign where we're seeing that Boeing is not going to get that multi-million-dollar tax break from the city this year. And so I don't know. I think I find hope in moments like that we are finding each other more, that we are connecting our struggles, and there are some wins. We need a lot more people in our movements. We need to be a lot more organized. We are not as powerful as the people that we're up against. And maybe the world is ending, but we have a stake in what comes after, what comes next. And yeah, I think that there is deep power in some of the movement building and connecting in ways that folks are doing that in ways that are not just the right thing to do, but are strategic and smart and necessary, and we just might win.
We just might win. We just might win. And as a combination, I hope you all are having lunch, but to Darren, who's asking us about chanting and music, are folks familiar with the song, Nalini Stamp, an amazing organizer, artist, cultural worker, wrote a song called The People Will Rise. The People Will Rise. And love this song. It's a great chant. I'm going to teach it to you. But I want to build on the theme of the conference. And so after I heard this song, I wrote another verse, which is also kind of this visionary world, imagining where we're going, and I think the next panel is going to take us there. But it goes like this. So I'm going to speak it, and then you'll speak it, and then I'll sing it, and then you'll sing it back to me. So this is, again, on the tune of The People Will Rise by Nalini Stamp. Okay, so it goes, welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. There's syncopation. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Again, welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. Welcome to the
Revolution
where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. Again, all you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. Okay, so welcome to the revolution where your shit's burned down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. Ready? Welcome to the, you can stand up, revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. The people are fire, the people are fire, the people are fire. One more time. Welcome to the revolution where your shit's burnt down. All you stole has now been recovered. What was lost is found.